In June 1942, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers burned in the blue waters of the Central Pacific. History books call it a triumph of code-breaking, courage, and luck, but if you look beneath the smoke of battle, you find something far cold, far more deliberate. The check that paid for the destruction at Midway was cashed long before the first bomb fell. To understand why the Japanese fleet was doomed, you have to stop looking at the warships and start looking at the balance sheets. War is not just an engine of destruction, it is an engine of consumption. Every ship that sails, every airplane that launches, represents thousands of factory hours, millions of gallons of refined oil, and irreplaceable human training. Midway was not just a battle between admirals. It was a collision between 2 radically different economic engines, and one of them was running on empty before it ever left port. Look closely at the Japanese fleet sailing toward Midway. It was the most lethal naval force on Earth, staffed by pilots with thousands of flight hours. Yet, beneath that terrifying armor, lay a fatal vulnerability that no tactical genius could fix. Japan had built a navy designed for a short, sharp war, a force of absolute quality, but zero elasticity. They could not afford to lose, because they could not afford to replace. When the Japanese launched their attack on Pearl Harbor, they didn't just target battleships, they targeted time. Japan's industrial capacity was less than 10% of the United States. Their entire war plan relied on forcing a quick settlement, before America's economic machine could wake up. But in doing so, they triggered a reaction that transformed the American economy into a weapon of unprecedented scale, and created a logistical nightmare Japan could never outrun. Consider this single detail. In May 1942, the American aircraft carrier USS Yorktown took critical damage at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Military experts estimated she needed 3 months of repairs in a shipyard. Admiral Chester Nimitz gave his engineers 72 hours. Over 1,400 shipyard workers swarmed the damaged ship in Pearl Harbor, working around the clock under blinding lights, patching hull plates and rewiring circuits while the engines were still hot. Why did those 72 hours matter so much? Because Nimitz was playing an economic game of margins. He knew he was outnumbered, but he also knew that every ship he brought to the fight changed the industrial math. By forcing the Yorktown back into action, America suddenly matched Japan's available carrier strength at the critical point of impact. The Japanese, assuming the Yorktown was at the bottom of the ocean, calculated their odds based on a phantom balance sheet, a miscalculation that would prove fatal. But the Yorktown was only a symptom of a much deeper industrial hidden mechanism. Consider the fuel that powered these massive fleets. An aircraft carrier consumes thousands of gallons of heavy fuel oil every single hour just to stay moving, to keep a fleet operational thousands of miles from home. You don't just need warships, you need an endless, unbroken chain of ocean-going tankers. And it was here, in the unglamorous mechanics of oil distribution, that the battle was truly decided. Japan had secured the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, but they faced an invisible wall. They lacked the tankers to transport that oil back home to be refined, and then out to the fleet in the Central Pacific. Every mile the Japanese fleet traveled toward Midway drew down a finite, irreplaceable reserve of high-octane fuel. Their commanders were operating under a ticking economic clock, forced to strike quickly because they literally could not afford to loiter in the open ocean. The Americans, on the other hand, were backed by the vast oil fields of Texas and California, connected by an industrial logistics pipeline that stretched straight across the Pacific. U.S. ships didn't just have fuel, they had fuel efficiency. The American supply network was designed around standardized cargo units and rapid offloading, allowing ships to spend less time in port and more time at sea. The invisible system was working, silently shifting the balance of power long before the planes took off. Then came the morning of June 4th, the moment of tactical contact. The world remembers the heroic dive bomber attacks, the sudden, catastrophic explosions that turned 3 Japanese carriers into blazing wrecks in less than 5 minutes. But what happened in those 5 minutes was not just a military disaster for Japan. It was an economic bankruptcy from which they could never recover. When the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu burned, Japan didn't just lose 3 hulls of steel, they lost hundreds of highly trained ground crews, specialized mechanics, and veteran airmen. These were men who required years of expensive, resource-intensive training to replace. In 5 minutes, Japan lost a percentage of its human capital that its educational and military infrastructure was physically incapable of reproducing before the war ended. Look at the American losses by comparison. The USS Yorktown was struck again, heavily damaged, and eventually sunk by a Japanese submarine. On paper, it looked like a crippling blow to the U.S. Navy. But inside the economic engine of the United States, the loss of the Yorktown was already accounted for. Shipyards in Brooklyn, Norfolk, and Newport News were already laying down the hulls of the new Essex-class carriers, built on standardized assembly lines with interchangeable parts. This is the central paradox of Midway. Japan won tactical skirmishes, but they were bankrupting their future with every engagement. America could lose a carrier and replace it within months, backed by an industrial worker base that included millions of women entering the manufacturing workforce. Japan lost a carrier, and the gap in their fleet remained forever. The math was relentless, cold, and completely indifferent to bravery. Consider the pilots themselves, a crucial resource often viewed only through the lens of combat skill. America created a massive, highly funded pilot training pipeline thousands of miles behind the front lines. Experienced combat pilots were routinely pulled from the front and sent home to become instructors, passing their knowledge down to thousands of new recruits. This turned human experience into a renewable resource, an economic flywheel of combat capability. Japan did the exact opposite. They kept their master pilots on the front lines until they were killed. When those elite airmen died at Midway, centuries of combined tactical knowledge vanished into the Pacific Ocean in a single afternoon. Japan had invested heavily in creating the ultimate warfighters, but had built zero infrastructure to replenish them. They had spent their human capital down to the last cent, leaving their remaining carriers crewed by inexperienced trainees who were easily shot down in subsequent battles. This structural failure extended deep into the design of their aircraft. The famous Japanese Zero fighter was a masterpiece of speed and agility, built light by stripping out heavy armor plate and self-sealing fuel tanks. It was an engineering decision driven by economic necessity. Limited engine power required a lighter frame, but that trade-off meant that when a Zero took fire, it burned instantly, taking its invaluable pilot down with it. American fighters, like the Wildcat, were built like armored vaults. They were heavier, less agile, but remarkably durable. American engineers understood an economic truth that escaped their rivals. An airplane is a machine, but the pilot inside is an investment. Protect the pilot, and he lives to fly another plane tomorrow. Lose the pilot, and the entire investment vanishes. At Midway, that design philosophy paid massive dividends. By the time the sun set on June 4th, the Japanese fleet was retreating westward, leaving 4 of their prime carriers behind.